Hi, one of the questions that we get asked about a lot, especially during this time of year from companies, is in terms of how do I streamline, how do I make easier my overall tax return process? And my response to that question is transfer as much of the burden related to tax return preparation over to your tax service provider, from the standpoint that tax returns are really kind of a side note with respect to your overall compliance efforts. It's really the tax provision and getting it rolled into those financial statements accurately and timely that's the most important aspect of any company's tax function. So really, as much of the burden related to the tax return preparation and filing and storage that can be transferred over to your tax service provider, the better. And at Clifton Douglas, we've instituted a process that we apply to tax return preparation that really does maximize this element of transferring the overall burden for tax return compliance over to the tax service provider. And we start out by really recommending to the company to align their tax service provider that prepares the company's tax provision with the tax service provider that prepares the company's tax returns, and try to make that tax service provider one and the same, from the standpoint that the company that puts together your provision already knows all the key aspects of the company for that particular year. They already know all the new filing states. They already know all the states where no longer a filing requirement is going to be necessary. They know all the significant impacts of new legislation, of new accounting pronouncements. They know all of the significant positions that a company has taken that particular year. And they can roll all of that data directly into the tax returns. If you have a whole separate tax service provider that comes in to prepare your tax returns, that it just creates a whole additional amount of effort really on the company's part in terms of transferring the same data that the company that prepared your tax provision already has, duplicating costs associated to that transfer of data. Also, really reducing accuracy, because sometimes certain things get lost in translation, and certainly duplicating efforts in terms of positions that are taking to make sure that they're accurate on both ends. I mean, it just creates a whole arena of difficulties when you have a separate tax service preparer for the provision and for the return, whereas if you align those two and you use the same tax service preparer, again, there is consistency throughout, and this reduces overall cost, this reduces overall time, and just makes the overall tax return process that much more seamless and that much more efficient. So that's our first recommendation to companies that we deal with, is to align their tax service provider in terms of the provision preparation and the return preparation. Now, aside from that, we really believe at Clifton Douglas in terms of preparing, really front-loading those returns as much as possible. And the first arena, the first time in which we front load those returns is really with respect to the extensions. And we're dealing with, I'll assume, March 15th, because we're assuming a calendar year and taxpayer for this video's sake, just for simplicity, but this applies equally well for fiscal year and taxpayers. But again, when you're dealing with those March 15th extension deadlines, that's the time to really kind of evaluate and understand the core pieces of the actual return filings. It's a time where you understand, okay, am I filing in all the correct states that I've noted in my tax provision? Am I filing final returns in those states where I no longer have a filing requirement according to my tax provision? Do I understand what the high tax liability jurisdictions are, and have I applied all of those mitigating strategies from my tax provision that we need in order to reduce those tax liabilities and the associated taxable income come time to actually file the original returns? Also, with respect to overpayments, have we reviewed the overpayments that we're making and carrying forward, and do they make sense? Maybe it's an instance in which case the company no longer has much activity in a jurisdiction, and so it makes even more sense to request a refund in that particular instance. So overpayments, are a key place to just evaluate and understand at the extension time period, so that you have a very good understanding as to the key components that are going to come about come time to file the actual or to prepare the actual returns themselves. Also, front loading those actual returns is really important, primarily from the standpoint that if you start in Q2 is typically a time where tax provisions themselves are a bit lighter, because you're dealing with projections, you're dealing with certain schedules that don't have to be completed, like the R&D credit calculations, state apportionment, deferred inventory. Usually these schedules are left until year end. So typically, Q2 tax provisions are a bit lighter than Q3 or year-end tax provisions. So to the extent that the actual returns can be front-loaded during a time frame in Q2 where other tax work is relatively light, again, it expedites the process. It makes the process that much more efficient. So we really try to front load those returns in terms of the extensions and actual preparation in Q2, latest early Q3, and that goes a long way. Also, we really try to be proactive with respect to tax return preparation, and this goes back to lifting that burden as much as possible off of our clients and off of companies in terms of tax return preparation. Instead of the company have to asking where the returns are, what's the status, so forth. I mean, we proactively send information requests right on the date where the return is, or when we need to get information related to preparing the return. We don't wait for the company to come and ask us. We provide status updates on a regular basis so the company understands where their returns are at, and they don't really need to worry about them. It's hassle-free. Also, when it comes time to actually file the returns, we schedule a meeting where we specifically go out, sit down with a company, go over the salient points, the most critical points of the return, and go ahead and have them sign off on those returns. And once all of that is complete, we actually take care of all of the processing. For paper filings, we walk all of those tax returns down to the post office and mail all of those returns along with the certified mailings and so forth. Same thing with electronic filings. We provide, even though the company has to do those typically, we provide very specific instructions in terms of exactly what it is that they need to do. So we take all of this burden off of them. And for a lot of companies, they're filing in 30 plus, 40 plus states. So it's a huge undertaking in terms of just this administrative requirement to file these returns. So to the extent that we can, as their tax preparer, do all of this for them, it allows them all of this additional flexibility to focus on the tax provision, the financial statements, and really running their core operations of their company. Also, with respect to storage, we take all of the returns themselves, all the applicable schedules, copies of the certified mailings, copies of the checks, all of that, we make copies and we actually store them on a secure online file system that's available to the client 24/7. So again, all of that storage of that information, that burden has been taken away, but the client still has access to all of this information at any time. It helps out tremendously, very tremendously. So again, to the extent that your tax service provider can be proactive so that you don't have to worry about your tax returns, you only need to have them really go over the salient points, the most important points of the returns, and really just have you sign off on them. I mean, that takes a huge burden away from you. All of that administrative burden is kind of out the door. Also, with respect to having your tax service provider stay with you even past the actual filings, with respect to notices that come up regarding those filings or audits that come up with respect to those filings. The tax service preparer is in the best situation, is best equipped to handle these follow-up questions because they're the ones that know in-depthly the details of these returns. So to the extent you can shift all of the burden related to dealing with these notices that come, after filings, or dealing with these audits that come after filings, again, it's going to free you up completely to do again, the most important things, which is focus on your tax provisions, focus on your financial statements, and just focusing on running your company. So again, really when companies ask the question in terms of how do I streamline my tax return, I really encourage them to work with a tax service provider in terms of having that tax service provider take the majority of that tax return compliance burden off of their shoulders. And that can be done quite easily if in fact the company starts by aligning and having the same tax service provider for both their tax provision as well as their tax return. From there, the overall process can be bolstered just in terms of front-loading data, making sure that you actually start the process when extensions are due in March 15th for a calendar year and taxpayer, and then front-loading the actual return preparation in Q2 where provisions are light, or early Q3. And then from there, really instituting a very proactive approach to preparing tax returns in terms of the tax service provider themselves being proactive, from information requests, from actually going over the returns, to doing all the filings for them, to doing all the storage of the filings. All of that should be done by the tax service provider. And then finally, having the tax service provider stick with the company even beyond the actual filing, so that they can, all that burden related to addressing notices and audits and those sorts of things that come after the filings can in fact be taken care of by the tax service provider. So again, once this burden is transferred, it just makes the process, the tax return process for any company, so much more simpler, so much more streamlined, so much easier, and it just frees up so much time for them to really focus on the important aspects of their tax function, which are again the tax provision, financial statements, and again core operations. So if you'd like to know more about our tax return process, then certainly you can visit us at cliftondouglas.com. Otherwise, give us a call, and thank you so much for watching this video. Have a great day. Bye-bye.